Hi, welcome back. Everything we've learned so far in all the previous lectures was really a preparation for getting started with calligraphy. Moving forward and starting from this course, we are going to concentrate and focus on the calligraphy framework itself, which is really the purpose of this entire course. So from the calligraphy course outline, if we go back to our lectures over here, we are now currently starting section number 2, and in section number 2, 3, and 4, we are solely going to talk about the calligraphy framework. We are definitely going to use a lot of the things that we learned in the preparation phase in the first section, but our main focus is mainly going to be around the framework itself, and more particularly about calligraphy. So what is calligraphy and what is a framework in the general sense? This is exactly what we are going to be learning in the lecture today. Before I start, let's go to lecture number 6, which is really what we are going to be talking about today. And in this lecture reference, you have the full instructions on how to install calligraphy locally on your machine and to start using it. What we're going to do in this lecture is going to be less about coding, and at least for the session for today, but we are going to learn, of course, how to install calligraphy, and we are going to look at the structure of the code itself, so that you're able to be more operational with it. But before we start all this, I would like to point you out to the calligraphy hub, to the calligraphy GitHub page. Okay, so calligraphy is an open source framework, and just like any other framework, which at some point we will talk about what a framework uh, is available for anybody to download. So it is public, and it's on GitHub, which we learned to know that it is the standard for getting getting open source code. So if we go to the Calligraphy Hub page, you have the link. You have the link directly from the lecture reference. If you go there, you're going to land on a page that is very similar to the one that we use for our lectures, okay? But it's dedicated for calligraphy, and it's public and open for everybody to use. And in that hub, or in that GitHub repository, you have the source code for calligraphy, which is the one we are going to be downloading. But most importantly, there is a big section on how to use calligraphy, and it's a very exhaustive documentation, which I happen to be the author of it. And what I am going to be doing in this course is more of a practical aspect rather than repeating what's in the documentation. I will definitely focus on what you need to know more in order for you to become more functional with the framework. But I will always go back and every once in a while refer to this documentation for each and every section that we will cover in this course. So now that we're here, let's go take a look at the documentation for calligraphy. There's about 13 sections up until now, but since the framework is evolving, more or less more or less sections might be added to this documentation. And along with the documentation, there are also some videos that are very dedicated to very specific points on a topic that the documentation is talking about. And I wanted you to know that these videos are also referenced in Udemy as extra resources, so you can always immediately have access to them if you want to know more about this. The section that we're concerned about today, in the session today, is going to be the getting started section that is within the calligraphy documentation. So I would like us to go and take a look in there. You'll see there are lots of similarities between what's in here and what's in our lecture, but sometimes the repetition is not a bad thing. The most important piece is that there are some videos that are identified within the documentation that could help you if you are more interested in seeing things live. It could help you figure. It will help you, illustrate some of these items that are mentioned in the documentation. All right. So now I'm going to go back now that we've done this, and let's go back to our lecture. All right, so let me talk a little bit about what a framework is. Okay, so now we know about PHP, we know about MySQL, we know about Apache and all of this, but what is a framework? If you haven't used one in the past, you might think that, oh, it's another application that I need to learn how to use, and so on and so forth. Yes and no. All right, there's some truth to both sides. But there is something very particular and very interesting about frameworks, specifically if you want to get into the world of development in general. You will realize the more application you create, once you get into the habit of it, there are pieces of codes that you will always need to do, and more or less they are repetitive. They might, of course, change, the context, change how certain data is being formatted and things like that. But overall, there are some basic features and functionalities that you will reuse. Okay, and the more you create, if you're doing things from scratch, you will have a tendency to copy and paste from previous work. What a framework does for you is it allows you to all these reusable functions and features. They come pre-packaged with the framework itself, so that you don't have to code them all over again. Okay, and they are evolving. They are sort of developing on their own to become more powerful every day. Almost every time there's a change, or there's an evolution in either the language, being PHP or MySQL, the framework, and whoever is behind coding that framework is making sure to keep you up to speed, and to have you stay up to date with all of these items, so that you don't have to do that mechanical work over and over and over again. So that's definitely one benefit to using a framework. Another benefit in frameworks in general, especially when you're a new developer, okay, there are lots of conventions and standards and code standards that are used among all programmers. Okay, there is no such a thing as a code of conduct or a code of programming or anything like that. Every language, every company, every group of people, every team might have their own conventions and own ways of doing things. So this is why there is no governance over how to code and how best to code. But there is a general consensus on certain things that probably you don't necessarily want to do things differently. Why is that? Because if you are open to share your code with other people to use, so if you are in the open source kind of spirit, or even if you want to share your code with somebody else, you want to minimize as much as possible the complexities that can come with a non-standard way of coding. Okay, imagine that if you have your own way and you're building something from scratch, you probably don't want that other developer who is using your code to relearn certain things over and over again, just because it's a one-off and you decided to do things in your own way. Now, there are general guidelines. They're not necessarily a hard constraint either, but the beauty of the framework is it helps you somehow follow and comply to these standards. And most precisely, this become more and more important in the way your files are structured in your application. Okay, file structure is has a big impact on understanding the code. So a framework comes with a certain way of kind of, I'm not going to say necessarily imposing, but putting a structure for you in place where you just start injecting your files in the right places, and just by doing that, it is somehow making your code more standard and easier to read. So that is benefit number 2 to the framework. Now, there are also downsides to using frameworks, and one, probably the most obvious one, is that there are many frameworks out there. Okay, each comes with its own philosophy, each comes with its own way of doing. Yes, there are some probably general guidelines that are used across the board, but each one of these frameworks has its own syntax, and there might be a little bit of a learning curve in the beginning to get up to speed and to learn how a framework does certain things. There are lots of framework out there. Okay, so there is Laravel, there is Cake PHP, there's Symfony. So there are a lot of others. Just by doing a search on Google, say PHP framework MVC specifically, and I will talk about the MVC in a while, you are going to land on a bunch of these frameworks. Calligraphy happens to be one of them. Now, why is calligraphy interesting compared to the others? Calligraphy managed to well, first of all, it's a lot easier in terms of the learning curve, okay, because it's closer to that developer who doesn't necessarily want to get too formalized in the framework environment. Okay, Laravel and Symfony, for example, are very formalized. Okay, they became more or less a language of their own that people need to study and learn. Okay, so calligraphy is smaller in scale than Laravel and the others. Okay, so despite the fact that yes, there is maybe a learning curve and there is some syntax that needs to be learned for calligraphy itself, but overall it is closer to the real PHP programming or to the not necessarily out of the box, but to the from scratch kind of programming. It still uses some aspect that still need to be coded manually, which kind of facilitates, in my opinion at least, it kind of helps you better understand how to operate with the framework. So that's one aspect to it. The second aspect of it is that it uses a lot of modern paradigms. Okay, so in a very easy way. So in a very easy way with calligraphy, you could add a payment for an e-commerce application. So if you want you want a payment gateway, it helps you do that very quickly. If you want crypto payments, so you want to pay with your bitcoins and things like that. Also, it has this feature where literally in one statement you can add an entire checkout process to your application. Okay, so there are lots of things like that, including social sharing and linking to social networks, the ability to include Google Analytics very quickly, the ability to create structured data that makes your every time somebody mentions your site, it makes it appear as a rich card. So all of these are come natively out of the box with calligraphy, and you can immediately use them in a very easy way. The other piece that is also relatively easier to use in calligraphy than in other spaces is the REST APIs. Okay, so today, every application, from the moment you want to extend it out for other people to use your services, there is a need to or one way to externalize your models or your database, and to allow other people, external people, to act on it using their own UI, their own application, and to add upon it. You need what we call the REST API. Okay, a REST API, it literally uses the HTTP protocol to help actually other programmers connect easily to your database, of course, if you give the permissions, and allow them to interface with your services while being used in a completely different application. We will learn about APIs further down throughout the course. But this is definitely another aspect where calligraphy stands out, where it doesn't matter if you're building your own application or not. The REST APIs come pre-built for you and ready to use almost instantly. All right, so that's about it on what a framework is. Let's now focus a little more on what an MVC framework is. Okay, and for that, let's go further down into the lecture itself. And MVC's framework does stand for what we call a model view controller architecture. Okay, this is more of a semantic architecture, and it's mainly about how the code is organized, but it also helps you understand a little bit how to structure your features and your functionalities within your files or within the classes of your application. A model view controller operates as follows. Okay, your very first layer of your application is your database, in this environment at least. And by database, we mean any form of storage where the user is storing the information through your application. Okay, so that is the database layer. The immediately other layers on top of it are the layers that are going to somehow allow you to interface with the database, but at the same time to display something to the users. Okay, that's what forms the application at the end of the day. There is a database layer, then there is a set of layers that helps you interact with this database by providing a user interface to the user. And in an MVC structure, there are three layers that are responsible for this relationship between the database and the user, the UI at the very end. The first one that would be interesting to talk about is what we call the model layer. The model layer is really that layer that will help replicate, okay, and notice my words, it literally is that, and it will help you replicate your database tables, just like we talked about in one of the previous lectures when we talked about MySQL. Each one of these tables is going to represent an object model that will live in your model layer. Okay, so every table will be replicated as a model in the model layer, and in that model layer you can act on the database itself. So the model layer is really the primary interface that will let you interface between the model, the object model, and the database, the equivalent database table, and it will help you do CRUD functionality, so things like creating, adding, and updating and reading from the database. And what happens is every time you perform one of these functions, it is the object model that is updated. Okay, so it is a layer that comes on top of the database. The second layer that is interesting to talk about is the third piece of the MVC, which is the controller. The controller is an intermediate piece that is in between the model layer and the view layer, which we will talk about in a while. And what the controller is going to do, the controller is going to take the triggers or the commands from the view layer that is coming directly from the user, okay, and it's going to transform it to a command that goes to the model layer, which will interface with the database, and then the database will return the information to the controller, and the controller will format it in a way that is displayable to the view layer, and the view layer will give it back to the user. Okay, so the controller is really that intermediate layer that will transform the information coming from the database into a piece of information that can be consumed by the view layer. Great. So what is the view layer? The view layer is your UI, all right? That is exactly what it is. It's your user interface. But it's not necessarily HTML and CSS, which is what people usually confuse when we talk about web programming. Everybody thinks that the view layer is HTML and CSS. No, not necessarily. The view layer is really, at least in the case of Caligraphy and in case of the MVC framework, it is really that layer that is responsible of building your HTML and CSS. So it is really the templates that are behind that are going to take the information coming from the controller, so take all the data coming from the controller, and then applying them to a template. And a template is really what ends up being compiled as an HTML and CSS that the browser will be able to read. So there is a logic that is there, which is literally a template logic, which is not necessarily an HTML and CSS, and we'll learn how calligraphy does it. It's a completely different language that uses some HTML. It's close to HTML, but it's a separate language that would help you build on the server side, not on the browser, but rather on the server side, templates that could help you generate HTML and CSS. And that is exactly what a view layer is. So those are, if you want, the four main components of an MVC architecture. Now, particularly with calligraphy, the view, the model and the controller are purely PHP. Okay, the database is MySQL. We use the MySQL language to create our databases, and our models and controllers will do any necessary PHP logic that would help us interface with the database. Great. But also, through the controller, there is a PHP logic that will help us interface with the views. Now, the views on their own, they are somehow the layer of them is written in PHP, but they do use a language that is separate, that is called Pug in our case. So Caligraphy uses Pug as the template engine that will get compiled on the server to generate HTML and CSS that your user can read from the browser. All right, and we will learn Pug, and you will see there is a very, very slight learning curve in the beginning, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes an absolutely marvelous language to use. Great. So that isn't just what an MVC framework is, and more particularly, Caligraphy uses exactly this framework. When we download it and when we look at the code structure, this will become a lot more actionable for you, and you will see very clearly where the models are, where the controllers are, and where the views are. Great. Now, in every framework, there are some basic concepts that are important to understand. So we touched upon the controller, we touched upon the views, we touched upon the models, we talked about the databases. There are other small components here and there, or small concepts here and there that we need to talk about. One of them is the routing. Routing is a concept that is everywhere in each and every framework. What routing really does, and when we get into the code, we'll learn more about this, but what routing really does is it takes the request that the user enters in the browser and it turns it into components that your code can understand. Okay? Traditionally, in web programming, before we started talking about routing and before we started talking about frameworks and things like that, if I open a browser to show you, when we used to do something like example.com/home/index.html, we used to do this traditionally. The way the server used to interpret this, used to say, all right, I need to go to my document root. Now you must understand what a document root is based on our previous lectures. It is really the root where the Apache server is going to be looking at. It's the primary folder where it's going to redirect every request to that folder. Okay, so it's going to go there, and then it's within that folder, it's going to look for another folder called home, and under home, it's going to look for a file called index.html. That's how we used to do it traditionally. With the concepts of routing, that we no longer need to do this anymore. You would want to separate, and that's for multiple reasons why you want to do that separation. One of them is for protection and security. You completely want to separate how your application is structured internally from the way the users are calling the features of the functions. So in that new world, you no longer need to do anything like that. Now what you need to do is you might want to say, for example, example.com/projects/1, and that would give you the details of project number 1. Okay? And it's no longer mirroring the file structure. The file structure behind has nothing to do with how the request is being handled. Now in this new world, and with the help of routing, what it's going to do, it's going to say, okay, I need to look for a controller called, not a controller, but I need to look for a path that that has the component project in it, and then /1, and I'm going to send that component for a controller to handle, and that controller is going to be able to understand what projects means and what number one means, and it's going to turn it into something that can be displayed by the user. So it's going to turn it into a request, into a query that can be understood by the database, and then the database is going to return results that the controller is going to push back to the browser. All right. So this beautiful concept called routing opens the possibilities to do a lot of things, especially when we start talking about APIs. This will help significantly. So this isn't just what routing is about. Now, there are other pieces of information that are important, and when we talk about framework in general, API is one of them. Well, when we talk about JSON, you probably heard the word JSON. You might have worked with it in the past, but JSON is just a structure or a syntax, yet another syntax of a file that is common to all languages. Okay, every language in the world, such as PHP, JavaScript, and even Java and C++, all of those, they use the JSON structure of files in order to read certain information. So it has become some sort of a standard for, especially if you wanna pass around the information from one server to another or from one language to another. It became sort of standard, and somehow everybody became compatible with it. And it's a structure that is very easy to read from and things like that. So it's important to understand JSON, because usually when APIs in the general sense, they always return a JSON, and this is specifically for the purpose of extensibility and specifically for the purpose of distribution. Okay, and like I said earlier, API is all about distribution, so it does make sense that it always returns your output in a JSON format, because the JSON format is compatible with anybody else who wants to consume it. Great. Now, at some point when we were doing the lecture on MySQL, we talked about relationships among the different tables. So relationships is obviously something that is very important to understand in the situation of a framework, and we'll learn more about this when we see it live in code. We're going to see how Caligraphy helps you create or use the relationships that are established in your databases. In terms of naming conventions, at some point we did talk about having at least in your MySQL tables, at least having every table needs to have an ID attribute. So this is one of the potential conventions. The other one is that your foreign keys always need to be named after the model name. So whatever you name your model, your foreign keys needs to be named after the model. Underscore ID when you're referring to them. So we'll get back to this when we work more with the code. Okay, so that's a little bit the gist of it. The other one, last but not least, concept is validation. Every input that you get from the user needs to be validated. Okay. Now, some people might say, "Oh, we could just validate it from JavaScript and directly block it on the browser side." This is not enough. Okay, it's not enough for a hacker. A hacker can very much go beyond what you're exposing to them on the browser, and they could find ways to inject information and inject data into as an input, which might be a security issue on your database. So validation is always necessary in order for you, one, of course, to make sure that that users are entering the correct information. So for user experience purposes, validation is necessary, but also for protection purposes, having that layer of validation that is done at the controller level helps you trap any potential vulnerabilities or any potential errors as well from getting dispatched to your database. Great. And now, once we download the code, we will look into the file structure. So let's go ahead and start downloading the code. In order to do that, the first thing we got to do is go back to the Caligraphy page. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to open it in a new tab over here. So let's go to the Caligraphy code page. Now, probably we haven't done this yet before. In order for you to get a code from GitHub, of course, you need to have GitHub installed and so on. So if you haven't touched upon that lecture, I strongly encourage you to go back and make sure that your environment is ready to do all this. So what we need to do is we need to get the address for cloning this code. Every time we download, we call it a clone, okay? Because you're taking a copy of this, so you're actually cloning it locally on your computer. So you're going to copy this. The way to copy it is you either select it and Command C or Control C on Windows, or you could click on that icon over here. And then you will open a terminal. All right. Make sure in your terminal to go to your document root. Now, in my case, my document root is sites, is the folder called sites. Well, and under there, I created a folder earlier that we call Calligraphy course. Okay. Calligraphy course like that. Now within Calligraphy course, I'm going to create another directory and I'm going to call it installation lecture. Okay, and this is only temporary. We are not going to copy that code, and you're not going to find it on our course GitHub repository, because it's just a copy of Calligraphy. We're not going to do more than this. We're not going to code anything. We might show some examples, but there's nothing to keep really. Okay, from the moment at least you are successful in the installation, that's what matters. So you don't need to copy, we don't need to show you anything in code necessarily. Most of the work we're going to do today is going to be on the terminal and on the editors, just for us to look at the file structure. So I'm going to make a directory or a folder called installation lecture in there. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to delete it. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to delete installation lecture, okay? And I will show you why in a while. Right. And so let me make sure it just has the files from last time. Great, database primer. Great. So what I am going to do, we're going to go ahead and clone. So in order to clone, I'm going to do git space clone, and then you're going to copy the address of paste the address that we just copied. Okay, now what I am going to do, if I do this and I hit enter, it is going to download Calligraphy under its default folder, and the default folder is called Calligraphy. So it's going to create under this Calligraphy course folder another folder called Calligraphy. Okay, now which this might be okay, but I would like to call it differently. And in order to call it differently, what you need to do is say the following. You are going to say space, and you're going to put the new name, and the new name that I want to do is installation lecture. And here we go. Now it's cloning. Great. So let me see what happened. Let me list over here. And when we do the listing, you see there's a new folder that got created. It's called installation lecture. So let's go to installation lecture. Let's list it out. And over here, you have the entire structure that you can find as well on GitHub. So that is the clone. It is an exact copy of whatever is on GitHub. Great. Now, let's go to our editor and look at what all these different files are in order for us to understand how this whole thing works. So I will open brackets, and I will go to this new folder that we created, which happens to be under Calligraphy course, and it's called installation lecture, and I'm going to open it entirely. Now let's go from the bottom up, okay, or in whatever order, but let's start with the files that are out there. There is a README file. That README file is written in yet another language called a markup language or a markdown language. Okay, this is just a quick way to write formatted text, which is very useful to create pages like this. Okay, so this page is literally exactly the page that is created by this MD file over here. All right. So that's the README. Usually under the README markdown, you would want to put things on how to install, what are the requirements, and any helpful tips and tricks for getting started quickly with the use of your code. Okay, so I will strongly encourage you for any application that you create to have that to have a README file with it. Great. Now let me go back to the terminal a little bit. In the listing of that folder, because this you won't be able to see in here, but there are some hidden files. One of the hidden files is called .git. Okay, this .git folder, it's a folder, not a file, is what is making the connection happen with the repository that is on GitHub. Now, from the moment you clone this locally, you ideally clone it in order to start a new application. So I would strongly recommend for you to remove it. And in order to remove it, you will need to do exactly the same commands that we saw in some of the lectures. Remove -r.git, because you want to break that link between the two. Why? Because you might want to create your own GitHub repository out of the exact same files, and you cannot have a link to two repositories, at least not in an easy way, and I would advise that you don't do that. So let's remove the git and break the connection. So right now, if I do git status, for example, there's still a git. There shouldn't be any git. Ideally, this is and should not be working anymore. Yes, it is untracked, but it is ignored. It was done before. I think even if you try to push, it will not work. Okay, so let me just go back here. Installation lecture ls-la, just to make sure we really got rid of the .git. Sure, let me get rid of .ignore as well. Just to make sure we get rid of everything. Okay, and now if I do git status, okay, I still have this, but ideally there is I don't think it will let you go through anyway, so you won't be able to do anything with it. Okay, voila. Now I initialized another one, and it has all of these. So from the moment you can initialize a new git, that means the old git is no longer there. All right. So now I'm going to delete it again because I don't want any git. Okay. And sure, there are untracked files, but at this stage, we don't care. And the reason why we still have this is because there are still some git ignores in the files themselves that is doing that. But we don't have to worry about it. There is no repository anyways, and the link with Caligraphy has been broken, so you can't push anything back. And anyway, you cannot push anything back because it's restricted. So you would be better off if you break that. Great. Now there is a set of other files that I want you to look at. One of them is .htaccess. .htaccess is an important file to have, whether it's on your own local environment or if in the future you want to upload that to a production environment, you need to have the .htaccess. What this .htaccess does, it's the base for the routing to work. In the absence of .htaccess, your the routing that we talked about will no longer work. What .htaccess is saying is any request that we get from the browser, we want to reformat it and we want to redirect it to index.php to handle, because this is where the magic is happening. All the magic of the framework is happening in index.php, which is really taking all the requests that are coming from the browser and making sure that they get dispatched to the right modules in the framework to do the work. Okay, so you need the .htaccess there. There are two other files before we talk about index.php. There are three other files that we need to care about. One of them is what we call the .env. Those are the environment variables. The environment variable are global variables that are used across the application that are very specific to an environment. Okay, so what do we mean by that? We mean uh, your development world or your development environment might have a different set of settings for the application than your production environment. So in order not to change the code of the application across the board, you would create variables that are all captured in one file that is called the .env, which has everything that you need about your particular environment. Okay, if you're on development, anything in here might be different than what is on your production environment. An example of this is your database access. So if you remember when we talked about PHP My Admin, you had a username and a password. Those username and password might change depending on whether you are on a local machine or on a production server. And when this happens, you might need to change these. And the best way to do that is to change them in the .env file. Now, there is no .env file, which is really what the application needs. All right, but what you have is a .env.example. So what you need to do next is from the folder of where you downloaded the framework. In my case, is installation lecture. What you need to do is copy .env example to .env. Okay, so now you will see in our structure we have a new .env file that has exactly the same content as .env.example. And now what I need to do is the following. There are multiple things that we need to change for our framework to work properly. One of them is we need to change the app root. Okay, the app root is where this code is. So it is an installation lecture, and it needs to be specified based on where it's located compared to the document root. So in my world, the way I downloaded this, I said it is under Calligraphy course /MVC, and this is my app root. Slash what was it called again? Installation lecture. Okay, this is exactly what where my app root is, and I will need to make sure to have that there. Okay, other things that might change. App.env is your environment. So for as long as you that it's not production, it is considered development. So from the moment you change it to production, that means you're on a production server, and you got to be careful not to use production all all the time. Make sure to use production only on your production server. Why? Because the application has some logic to read certain things depending on whether it's local or production. I would say for as long as you are in your development environment, stay under local, or you could also say it's a development. Great. Now there's something called the app key. App key is consider it as a password to your application. This is a key that is going to be used throughout the application for any security reasons and protection reasons, because it is going to be the key that is going to encode any information in your application. If you give that key, then anybody who has access to the code will be able to decrypt any information that you are encrypting throughout the application. So keep that key handy and keep it secret, of course. And what you need to put here is what you believe your app key. In order for you to generate app keys, there are multiple ways to do that. At the end of the day, it ends up being a series of it's a string of characters, and it could be 128 characters or 256 characters. It would be up to you to determine that. If you want smaller, you can have it smaller as well. All this will be up to you. Now, just for testing purposes on local machine, you can put just any sequence of characters. Okay, and you'll notice that from the moment you change that, then your entire application encryption would be different. App protocol depending on whether you're on a local machine or on a production server. On your local machine, you might have SSL, installed or set up. An SSL is just a secured, it's a secured protocol, so it's a similar protocol to HTTP, but everything is encrypted within it, and it's definitely the way to go for any application that you create, especially when it goes live on production. What you need to do is, from the moment you have SSL set up and you are handling all your requests through HTTPS, then in that case you would say that your app protocol is HTTPS. If you don't do this right, then you might end up with a mix of HTTP and HTTPS, which is definitely something you don't want. For as long as you are on a development environment and you're not using secure HTTP, then in that case keep it HTTP. App debug is another flag that is used by the application, and you'll learn more about this when we talk about Composer and the dependencies. But in some situations, you might want to use some external code from other people only on your development in your development environment. So in order for you to do this without having to delete it each and every time you upload to production, you would just set the app debug to true, and the application knows that everything that's app debug set to true, all the dependencies that are specified under a particular under the Composer, which we will talk about under the Composer file, will not be taken into account if your app debug is set to true. All right, app root we talked about. Fav icon is really the icon that appears up here. Okay, every application has one, and over here, if you really if you wanna apply it to your let me dismiss these notifications. I apologize for that. So if you wanna set your own icon, you will need to specify where it's located in your file structure. It will always go and look under public, okay, and under images, and whatever. If your .ico file is somewhere in this image repository, whether it's directly under here or it's in a subfolder in there, it doesn't matter. It will be able to read it. But the requirement is that it's always under the images under public. Okay. Any file that you need to reference and that is also publicly accessible always needs to be under the public folder. The public folder has everything that you need, and you can create as many folders and subfolders in there, but that's where you need to store any file that you need that is publicly accessible. So anything that is used by the user browser, such as your style sheets, CSS, JavaScript, or any sort of scripts or fonts or anything like that, needs to be under the public folder. Also, any files that you want your users to upload need to live somewhere on your server. They need to live within this area over here. They need to live within Caligraphy, and they can only live under the upload folder. Okay, the upload folder will be the only folder that will have permissions for your users to upload to and to so not only to read from, but also to write to. And I will show you how to do this once we talk about images and we start using the framework a little more. Great. So that kind of summarizes also the public folder. We don't need to talk about it anymore. Great. Now there's something called app locale and server time zone. App locale and server time zone are extremely important, especially if you are deploying your application in different languages and in different countries. Okay. App locale is all about languages and formats in the general sense. Where I happen to be, the locale is English and US. But if you want to, switch to French or Swedish or Finnish or any other language, then you need to choose the right app locale for that. Okay, and that would help not only in the language, but it would also help in the formatting of numbers, formatting of currency, and things like that. Okay, Server time zone is really where you want, or at least what time zone the server needs to have. Okay, remember when we were talking about MySQL and we were creating MySQL tables and stuff? Every table does have a created at date and time and a modified at date and time. So this is an example where the time is automatically generated on the server side. So it needs to have a time zone that is very close to where the user is being served. Okay. In my case, where I stand, my server happens to be in America, New York, which means, or the closest one to where I am is America, New York. So everything that is in my database is really all the times, the dates and times are formatted and calculated based on this. Great. Now, DB, anything under DB, we'll talk more about when we start connecting our database or the database that we created or that we will create. Then we'll talk about these. Mail and host when we talk about emails, if we ever gonna get to that lecture. And this is where you put the credentials for your mailing server. Anything that is underneath, so public pay public, pay private, pay public, pay private. I'll talk about these when we talk about payments. So this is Caligraphy uses a third-party tool that would require these keys. So you have them under your .env as well. For crypto payment, you also have another key that the third-party tool that we use will help you, or that we interface with will give you that information. If we use social sharing, and more precisely, you want to post or share your website on Facebook and so on, then you need to have a Facebook app ID. So when that happens, you need to enter it in here. And at some point, we're going to talk about Google Analytics and stuff like that. And you will need an ID as well for Google Analytics to behave, or for Google Analytics to read your file and to get information from not from your file, but from your application. Then you need to provide it an ID as well. So this isn't just what .env is about. We will start filling this as we go, and then every time we make a change to it, we'll see what the impact is on the application that we're going to be creating. The other two files that I want to talk about are the composer files. Calligraphy uses different third parties. Okay, so we mentioned one for payment, one for crypto payment. So for payment we use Stripe. For crypto payment we use Coinbase Commerce. That's mainly for the US. For validation we use a library called GUMP. So all these dependencies we don't necessarily, and they are not necessarily part of the code of Calligraphy, but they can get installed automatically using Composer. And this is why I wanted you in the very early stages of this course to have Composer ready, because this is exactly where we're going to be using it. And all these dependencies are defined under a file called Composer.json. Every application that is built with PHP and that uses dependencies has a composer.json file that describes what the application is about and so on, and that has a required field in here. Okay, this is what says require, and those are the dependencies that Calligraphy uses. Okay, those are extremely important, and since you're building on top of Calligraphy, then these need to remain in there even in your application. What you can change as part of your application, because now we've broken any connection with Calligraphy, is the name, the description, the keywords, the type, the license, the author. All this can be changed. However, the requirements, so the require field, these absolutely need to be there. You can add upon them, but from the moment you start changing stuff, then we cannot guarantee that the framework will continue to work. Okay, so now these dependencies, but where are they? That's really the big question. And that is when we go back to the terminal. Because in order for you to get the dependencies, there is something else that you need to do, and it's the following. You need to do composer install. And from the moment you do composer install, you will notice all the dependencies are getting installed now, and they are becoming part of your code base. Okay, it might prompt you to say yes every once in a while, so don't hesitate to say yes. Okay, it's still installing, and voila, it says packages installed. So now if we go back to our structure, now there's a new folder that got added, and that folder is called vendor. Under vendor, you find all the dependencies that Calligraphy needs, but not only the dependencies that Calligraphy needs, but also any dependencies that those third parties need will also get installed, and they become part of your code base. The reason why you do not see them in GitHub, it's because they take a big amount of memory. Okay, you need a lot of storage in order to store all the dependencies up there. So Composer does this beautifully for you. There is no need for you to get them and to get the code directly from GitHub, but you can just unpack the package itself, and it will automatically download them for you. And this is really the magic of Composer. So now with that, we are almost done with our lecture. I just want to point out the other folders that we have out there very quickly, because we're going to spend a lot of time on them in the next lecture. Now, okay, the first one is tests. The test folder is empty. Look at it. There's nothing in it. Okay, but this folder is prepared for you to create any classes, any objects, anything in here for testing purposes. Anytime you want to test something, you can come and test it out, and the framework gives you that ability to do that under this folder. Okay, so any classes from the framework and stuff like this are accessible from within this folder as well. The public folder we talked about. For the framework folder is really where the magic of Calligraphy is happening, and it's open source. You can go ahead and look at the code. I would suggest that you don't change it in the beginning, because literally those are the core files that run Calligraphy. So any change that you make in here might lead to some problems with the work, with the way it functions. We will dig further into them as we go into the documentation, and we will learn more about some of these functionalities. But I want you to know that really the brain of Calligraphy is under the framework folder. Now, under the framework folder, it's also structured in a way where the core classes are all in here. Under the core classes, we see things like model, like controller, like root, like request, like payment. So all these concepts that Calligraphy helps you do more quickly than if you were to do it manually are all coded in here, and you are more free than going in there, and more free to go in there and to take a look at them. Okay, that's what's happening under the core folder. Under the database folder is really this what we call let's call it an engine for now, but it's more of an adapter really that will allow you to interface with any sort of databases, not just MySQL. Okay, MySQL is the language of preference, but if you use Oracle SQL, if you use Microsoft SQL, or any other SQL interpreter, then this is the logic that helps you make sure to that helps do all the translation for you, so that you don't have to worry. Helpers are a series of methods, and they are global methods that can be used anywhere in your application, that are given to you by Calligraphy, and that will help you significantly. We're going to use a lot of those core helper methods across the board. I will point them out every time we use them. Some of them, can help you do some string manipulations or array manipulations in an easier way. Some of them can access some of the view and models functionality in a quicker way. So there is a series of functionalities and features that are used in there for to help you work faster. Okay, I will mention them as we go when we stumble upon them. Okay, libraries are any additional libraries that you need to add to Calligraphy. You can put them in here. These can be your own created libraries, your own created code. Feel free to use that repository whichever way you want. Okay, and then under settings are the core settings for the calligraphy, and these settings are default settings. Okay, there is something given to you by default. When we talk about views, you're going to see a lot of those. When you talk about metadata, you're going to see a lot of those and things like that. But all of these, I would suggest not to change that file at all. All of these can be changed through helper methods that are given to you, so you don't need to worry about them at all. So that is what is under framework. The file or the folder where you're going to spend most of your time is the application folder. Okay, this is where you come into the game as a user of the calligraphy framework. So over here it's structured exactly according to the premise of calligraphy. There is a folder called views, there is a folder called models, and there is a folder called controllers. Okay, all your controllers will live in here, all your models will live in here, and all your views will live in there. And you can create as many subfolders as needed. There are some views that are given to you out of the box and some controllers that are given to you out of the box. This is just to make things easier. So things like authentication, having a username and password in your application, which is done exactly the same way almost everywhere. You might add things to it, but the logic of it and the routing logic of it is always the same. So these are given to you out of the box if you want to use them or not. It's a choice, but at least they're given to you as an example for you to use. Okay, so these you can find under the auth, whether under controller, model, or view, and you have the models for them, the views for them, and the controllers for them. Under the views, you have you have a default theme that is given to you. That is if you really don't want to get into creating your basic navigation and structure and stuff like that. We are giving you some themes out of the box to use. When we start talking about views, you will understand why this can become very handy for you. Okay, especially if you want to build quickly some administrative forms and things like that, then they could help you significantly. Okay. So that's what's under each one of those. Then come another folder that you're going to spend a significant time in. It's the config folder. Under the config folder, you have a file and a folder. The config file are any global variables that you want to use or that you want to change. So any core settings that you want to change or any global variables that you want your application to use. You will put them all in here. Any changes to the core settings that we saw earlier on the framework happens in the config.php. Okay, you may or not use it. If you leave it empty, that's fine too. But if you want to use it, you can use that space to change any configuration and any settings right in here. In this file, you can only use helper methods and defining variables, but nothing more. Okay. So it's always about global variables, session variables, and then making changes to core settings. Then you have the routing folder. Under the routing folder, there's something called web.php. This is where all the magic of routing happens. Okay, routing is really extremely important. We're going to touch upon it in the next lecture, but this is exactly where all the magic will take place, and we will get back to it in our next lecture. With that, I hope this gives you an idea at least about the structure of calligraphy, about calligraphy as a framework, and about calligraphy as an MVC architecture. I hope this has become clearer for you. If it hasn't, then the references can always help you. And by references, I mean specifically the calligraphy documentation can give you all the information or all the additional information that you need in order for you to grasp all these different concepts. You can also rely on our lecture. It has a significant amount of everything that I said today in the video. So I hope this can help you become operational quickly. In the next lecture, we are going to dig further into routing, controllers, and models, and we're going to start coding finally using calligraphy. With that, I wish you a fantastic day, and I hope to see you in our next lecture.